glad to see you. And I'm glad you came in out of this heat wave we're having from last week and have joined us this morning. I want to especially thank all the people who have made Convocations 1989 a success this year. There are so many of them, I can't read them off. All I can say is there are a lot of hands that fed a lot of good energy into putting this week together, and I hope it's a learning and a growth session for all of us and for the students who support it. I especially want to thank you students for coming. There is one student in particular who I would like to call up on stage. He's the young man who designed this year's Convocations poster and the front to your program. Is Jack Orr in the audience? Is he here? There he is. At this time, I'd like to turn the program over to the President, who has a few words to address to you. Thank you.
Good morning. This lady is Jean Ann Mitchell, and she's been the chair of this committee, and I think she neglected to introduce herself, and I think you all should know that she has put a lot of work in on this program and bringing it together. The reason I wanted to address you this morning is, first of all, I believe so sincerely that it's important that we come together as a student faculty, as a group once in a while, and there are very few occasions that can happen. Convocations presents that opportunity. It presents you to come together as a body to see what we're like. We really should have everybody here and fill this place, but we're getting better at that. The other reason is, I think in terms of your total college education, you need an opportunity to go beyond the classroom, and this particular program, extended throughout the week, allows you to do it. So I'm very pleased with the idea. I'm particularly pleased that you're here, and I hope this is something that you can take as an addition to what you have in your classes. I want to say to you this. I've been to the programs in the past, and people have been, well, a little worried that they can't make their next class, so they have to get up and leave before the speaker's finished. Don't worry about it. If anybody gives you any problems, tell them to see me. I want you to stay through the program. If you've got a class coming, they can wait. This is one time you stay and you enjoy what the speaker has to say. I think it will be the kind of thing that we all need to do more often. For those of you who are not students and are part of the community, we are very happy that you're here, and bring your friends. We've got programs all week and we'd love to see you. The fellow that's going to introduce our speaker today is a fellow that many of you know. He's done a variety of things, including playing Santa Claus, if you were at the music concert. Duke Snyder is responsible for the programs in anthropology, and it's his pleasure, I think, this morning to introduce our speaker. Duke?
Thank you, President Bennett. My name is Duke Snyder, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for coming to today's Convocation presentation. There are many other events scheduled this week, and pocket-sized scorecards are available around campus that will list all of these events as well as the folders you've been given. I think that we should stop for a second and have Jean Ann Mitchell stand up not only on her own behalf but on behalf of the Convocations Committee while we show her a little appreciation. It's a hard, hard job. Today's guest and our keynote speaker is Mr. Alfie Kohn. He is a scholar, teacher, journalist who has become a leading critic of the role of competition in America. In his book, No Contest, the Case Against Competition, he claims that any arrangement in which one person's success is dependent upon another person's failure is psychologically destructive, poisonous to relationships, and counterproductive. Contrary to what most of us have been taught, Mr. Kohn argues that trying to beat others is not an inevitable part of human nature. It does not build character, and it actually holds us back from doing our best work. Just as an aside, Mr. Kohn will be in the bookstore this afternoon from 2 to 3, autographing copies of his book, if you would like to have a copy autographed. And there just happens to be paperback editions available in the bookstore. Mr. Kohn has argued his case on more than 100 radio and television broadcasts across the country, including The Phil Donahue Show. His arguments have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, the San Francisco Chronicle, and other leading papers. He is a current resident of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and was educated at Brown University and the University of Chicago. He's been a visiting lecturer at a number of colleges and universities dealing with such topics as abnormal psychology, political theory, guilt, humor, dreams, competition. Mr. Kohn is a contributing editor at Psychology Today and writes regularly for a number of other publications, including Atlantic, The Nation, and the New York Times Book Review. By the way, Mr. Kohn's avocation is writing and performing satiric songs. He wrote Waltz for One, which was a poke at the self-help movement, and Stopping by Rosemary Woods on a Snowy Evening was a poke at Mr. Nixon. Without anything else, I would like with deep pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Alfie Kohn.
Thank you. That sordid part of my past in which I wrote songs of that sort, I didn't expect to be part of this symposium today. I couldn't help noticing there's competition all around us. We all learn it beginning with musical chairs and birthday parties, sort of a prototype of artificial scarcity. X number of children, X minus 1 chairs. And that's exactly what we had here, wasn't it? Somebody had to be standing the whole time. There's 4 people in 3 chairs. And you can't escape this sort of thing. On the subject of competition, there are exactly 2 respectable positions in this country. Can you hear me okay with this jazzy mic here? There are exactly 2 respectable positions on competition. The first, let's call it the conservative position. We'll use these words a little differently than they're usually used. Unqualified endorsement, the Vince Lombardi position. Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there, and we better get kids ready for that canine consumption as quickly as possible. It builds character. If you can't stand it, get out. Competition's what made America great, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's the liberal position, which goes something like this. I call it modified or qualified endorsement. We've gotten carried away with competition in this culture. We've gone too far. We push our children too hard and too fast to compete. But if we keep things in perspective and we don't get carried away, then some competition, of course, is not a bad thing, and it can be useful and healthy and productive and so on. That's it. Those are your 2 choices. I used to be a member of the second camp, the so-called liberal school, as I'm calling it here. After about 400 or 500 studies that I've been going through over the last 6 years or 7 years, I have begun a 3rd camp, of which the membership may be limited to 1, I'm not sure. And that is the following position. Hold on to your chairs, because it's going to strike a lot of you as heretical, unorthodox, to say the least. Shocking, maybe even un-American. Definitely un-American. And the position is as follows. Competition is not bad because we do it the wrong way. Competition is not bad because we do it too much. Competition is inherently destructive. By its very nature, an arrangement that pits us against one another is counterproductive and bad for us. The ideal amount of competition is 0 in any environment. The very phrase, healthy competition, is actually a contradiction in terms. Now, I don't expect that most of you, perhaps any of you, agree with that now, and with all due respect to my own talents as a speaker, I don't expect that all of you will come out of here in an hour believing that position. But I want you to understand that the data, the actual research, support a position very different from the one that we were all raised to believe. Because in this culture, we were raised not only to compete frantically, but to believe in competition. And my book is centered on what I call the central 4 myths of competition, which I'll get to in a couple of minutes. Let me first start, as any good social scientist would, by defining my terms. I distinguish between what I call structural competition and intentional competition. And this is all the jargon I'll throw at you. You know, these words that make it sound respectable in social science, where simple words are really adequate. Otherwise, they don't get published if it sounds too simple. Structural competition means I succeed only if you fail. That's the way the game is set up. Musical chairs. In the strongest version, I can succeed only if I make you fail. In the weak version, say golf or bowling, I do something, then you do something, then I do something, then you do something, and at the end we compare our scores, and whoever has the best score wins. We don't interfere with each other's performance. In the strong version, I succeed only if I make you fail. We see that in, say, war or tennis. Because if you'll think about it, the point of a game of tennis is not merely to get more points at the end. It's to make you fail at each instant of play. A good shot, by definition, consists of a shot you cannot return. We are working at cross purposes for the entire time. Now, I'm not on a crusade nationwide for the abolition of tennis, but I want us to understand what the principle is that lays behind it. And this structural competition says it's not because you're neurotic or malicious that you want to make the other person fail. It's because that's the way the game is played. Tennis, or war, or a lot of workplaces around this country today, or our economic system, or classrooms in which teachers grade on a curve, so there are only so many A's to go around. If I get one, that reduces the chance that you're going to get one, so we've got to work at cross purposes. We are rivals, not potential collaborators. That's what structural competition means, the arrangement set up that way, like it or not. Now, the other part of competition is what I call intentional competition. And that doesn't refer to the arrangement, that refers to the attitude. That's a personal need to be number one. There are some people who need this all the time, who think desperately in terms of beating other people. Now, the reason I distinguish between these two is because it's useful for us to think of the topic in terms of how you can have one without the other. Can you have intentional without structural competition? Sure. There are probably people who came in here today being most concerned about whether they're the best dressed or the smartest person in the room. Even though there are no prizes being given out for that this morning, everyone else just thought they were attending a lecture. Nobody knew that it was a competition. No structural competition, but the need to be number one. But the reverse situation is what I want to linger on and have you linger on after I leave. Structural competition without intentional competition means that even though you personally may only care about doing your best, reaching excellence, maybe having a good time, you are placed in a situation in which success is confused with victory, in which the only way you can do well is to trample on other people, because that's what the rule of the game requires. And I can't think of a better way to tie this topic in to this week's focus in this convocation ceremony than to define that as a kind of oppression. We are oppressed to the extent that we want to help other people, or at least don't want to hurt them. We simply want to pursue our own goals, but because of our workplaces and our playing fields and our classrooms, and tragically enough, sometimes even our families, they are set up in such a way that I can make it only if you don't. And I've got to win, not just be good. And so that leads to people becoming competitive themselves or dropping out entirely and thinking, I'm no good, what's the point of even making an effort? The human costs of people in competitive environments against their will is staggering. And it ranges all the way from little children who no longer can have a good time, they have to be thinking in terms of who won, all the way up to the most tragic and frightening and nightmarish possibility of all from competition, and that is the arms race that could exterminate the human race, which comes from precisely this sort of zero-sum thinking. If it's good for them, it must be bad for us by definition. I want to talk about cheating. Cheating is something we see all the time. We see it in every aspect of our society. We see it in every section of the newspaper. Let's go back to the conservative, again in quotation marks, and liberal positions on this topic. The conservative approach to cheating says, if it's a minor infraction, a little aggression maybe in the workplace or on the football field, well, that's all in the name of the game, no problem. If it's really serious, say someone gets his head lopped off in the football field, or you're caught red-handed stealing somebody else's documents so that your corporation can gain more market share, well, then what we do is we punish the individuals. And that's always the response here of this position. Blame the individuals, as if they had acted alone, as if it had never happened before, as if they acted out of sheer perversity to cheat and do violence against other people in their quest for victory. 3 or 4 years ago, 38 people were killed in a soccer riot in Brussels. You remember that? What did Margaret Thatcher say? It's a bunch of hooligans, she said. Bunch of hooligans. Blame those individuals. It was alcohol. Let's just ban that and the problem will be solved. Never mind that this sort of thing keeps happening. Many more people died in Peru in a soccer riot some years before. And even when people don't die, the hideousness of that kind of competitive sports where fans get rabid is something we see almost all the time. So the conservative says, blame the individuals and forget about what else might have caused the problem. The liberal response to cheating is to say, come on, let's obey the rules. Don't get carried away. Competition's good, but don't abuse it. The emphasis is on how the game is played. You cite role models of the occasional person in the legal profession or in business or in sports or whatever. Now there's a good sport. See how he shakes the hand of his opponent? I actually read one article several years ago by such a critic who said that in sports we will solve all our problems if opponents don't address each other as opponents. They call each other associates. Just change the language. Poof, the problem disappears. Now, the shared assumption here of the conservative and the liberal perspective, which I assume you share, in fact, this assumption is as follows. If there is ugliness in competition, that is a contamination of real competition. Competition itself is fine. It's just that some people aren't doing it right. Now, in this country, we have a notorious unwillingness to look at structural causes of problems, to look at what underlies things that go wrong. We always say blame the individuals. So, if we have poverty, we say those folks are lazy, get a job. If we have problems in our educational system, we say the kids aren't studying hard enough, or the teachers are unqualified. If we have people committing crimes, as we do in this country far more than almost any other country in the world in terms of violent crime, well, then the response is just, they're bad, lock them up. Never do we look at the forces that are social and historical and economic and political that might help to explain where these things really come from. And we don't have time today to look at poverty and crime and educational problems, but we do have time to look at competition. And my argument is that competition is the problem. You open up the business pages and you see another report about people bribing to get a higher return on investment, say, in a foreign country. American corporations in foreign countries, I mean. You see people, over here in the local section is something about a medical researcher who was caught fabricating his data in the desperate quest to get published and tenured in that. Over here in the sports section, well, we have lots of things to go from in the sports section. Here we got what? The college recruiting scandals and steroid use and people beating up the referee during Olympic boxing matches instead of each other, which they're supposed to do. That's good violence, that's bad violence. And you have problems of various kinds. In campaigns, we learn about problems there too. You know, all sorts. I mean, Watergate, after all, was nothing more than cheating during a competition. Remember Watergate? Well, this thing happened a long time ago. Anyway, in each of these elements of the newspaper, in each part of our lives, we come across these examples of competition gone bad. But we never stop and say, what do all these things have in common? What they have in common is structural competition. Is an arrangement that says, I can succeed only if you fail. Over the last few years, I've been clipping things out of the newspaper, which I do almost compulsively. And I want to read you 3 short excerpts from 3 very different people talking about cheating in different arenas of life. The first one is from Kenny Hill, who's a safety for the New York Giants. Quote, "We are expected to go through a mental metamorphosis to go from being gentlemanly and following the rules of society to people who play violently and aggressively for 2 or 3 hours on Sunday. It causes us to do things out of character. We have to be able to call up those tendencies on demand and 3 hours later submerge them on demand. It's not easy to do, especially when people across the line of scrimmage are literally the enemy." Second is a political consultant talking about negative advertising. Remember that last campaign? Remember that? He furloughs rapists. He doesn't say the Pledge of Allegiance, etc. A political campaign, says Mr. William Zimmerman, a California consultant, like a trial in a court of law, has but one objective: to win. Staying within the confines of the truth, a candidate or consultant will use every available legal means to attain that objective. If you don't play by the rules of the game, your opponent will. And third, a Mr. Gary Edwards of the Ethics Resource Center is talking about new courses being developed at business schools, and in particular Harvard Business School, to teach those students who are about to go into the highest ranks, the highest echelons of corporate control, a little ethics. And here's what he says. As long as you have a business culture that puts people in impossible situations, your division has to grow 7% in the next year, or else we're going to be number 2 in the field, and if we are, you're going to be job hunting. You're going to have people shipping inferior goods, juggling the books, bribing when they have to, trampling workers beneath them, and generally conducting themselves in the time-honored tradition. Results, and only results, count. Politics, sports, business. All 3 of these people talk about the fault being structural. These are self-serving people in 2 out of the 3 cases. They have something to gain by saying, don't blame me. But maybe they have something to teach us about whether we're being naive or even hypocritical in continuing to assume that we can blame individuals when things go wrong with competition. Maybe cheating and self-destructive behavior and violence are not the contamination of competition. Maybe they are the true consummation of competition. Sportsmanship, after all, is nothing more than an artificial way to say, sure, go after them, win, do all you can, but stay within the rules and make it look gentlemanly. After all, if people were out there on the playing field playing a cooperative game, there wouldn't be any such thing as sportsmanship. There wouldn't be any need for it. Because no one would be trying to beat each other, yet having to keep that within bounds. People would be rooting for each other anyway, from the beginning. There are a lot of concepts like that which I urge you to think about. Things we think are just come down from the heavens, are eternal truths which in fact depend on social structures. In cultures where there's no private property, where everybody shares everything, there's no such thing as theft. I don't mean people don't steal. I mean the concept has no meaning. See what I mean? There's no such thing as blasphemy unless you believe in God. There are all kinds of ideas like that. Where I live in Boston, there's no such thing as jaywalking because there's no norm that says you're supposed to cross at the intersections. The concept has no meaning. I mean, it's true of many things like this. And it is certainly true with respect to sportsmanship. The idea of sportsmanship and fair play has meaning only if we have first set people up against each other as enemies. And I don't think the word enemies is too strong. George Orwell called sports war minus the shooting. But I'm not just on a crusade against sports. I want to talk about where it's really important. Bertrand Russell saw this very same problem when he analyzed our society. He wrote as follows. The trouble does not lie simply with the individual, nor can a single individual prevent it in his own isolated case. The trouble arises from the generally received philosophy of life, according to which life is a contest, a competition, in which respect is to be accorded to the victor. This view leads to an undue cultivation of the will at the expense of the senses and the intellect. But all of this may put the cart before the horse as far as you're concerned. What about those beliefs? What about competition being good for you, at least in moderation? As I have gone around expressing this rather extreme point of view that competition itself is bad, I am alternately called a communist and a wimp. Never both, interestingly enough. Yes, it's important. You can't be both, otherwise there's no enemy to marshal up the forces for the military and so on. When I was on the Phil Donahue show, I was asked, if you're against competition, isn't that just because you're a loser? I invite you to think about how you would answer that question in 8 seconds on national television. I'll give you a hint. There's no right answer. Because it's a threatening position. You and I have all been raised from the very beginning to think that the way to prove that you're good is to beat other people. We've been raised, as I said before, with 4 specific beliefs about competition. I want to review them quickly now. Obviously, there's a lot of evidence here, and there are a lot of possible questions that I can't possibly get to. But I want to raise the issues and get you thinking, at least questioning, subversively, radically. Because radical means of the root. That's what the word radical means. It means you don't ask the little questions you're allowed to. It means you ask the underlying assumption questions you're not supposed to. The first myth is that competition is just part of human nature. What a charming idea to think we can talk about cooperation. But unfortunately, that's just the way life is. Now, I have heard this over and over and over again at dinner parties and in magazine articles. And so when I started researching this subject in the early 80s, I assumed there'd be a lot of substantiation. I can't find a shred, I still can't to this day, find a shred of evidence to back up this commonly held belief. Whenever you hear the phrase human nature, incidentally, I urge you to be very cautious and suspicious. If I had my way, every word processor in the country would be rigged up so the phrase human nature always appear in quotation marks. But what does it mean? This is a way of frustrating change, folks. This is a profoundly conservative argument masquerading as realism. It's a way of saying, I don't want to deal with whether you have a good idea. I want to wave you out of the room by saying it's naive. What does it mean to say it's just human nature? It means that this is the way all humans always have been and always will be in all cultures. How many things can we really say that about? Where's the evidence for it? I'm now writing a book that looks at questions of altruism and aggression, and I did some work on the study of aggression here too, and once again we find that some cultures manage somehow to do very well without it. Some cultures are entirely non-competitive in their educational systems, in their economic systems, in their way of having fun. Imagine games without winners and losers. Now most of these cultures are what are typically called by, or were called by anthropologists, primitive cultures, or what I like to call non-VCR cultures. Does that mean that we can be just like them by next week? No. In fact, we probably can't be just like them, nor would we want to, in all respects, ever. But you know, it's kind of interesting for this human nature argument, when you think about it. If these primitive cultures, some of them, not all, are entirely non-competitive, that's just the opposite of what we would expect if competition was really part of human nature. They're closer to nature, aren't they? And in fact, we find just the opposite. It's when they get more civilized, I'm sorry, I'm overusing these quotation marks. My fingers are getting tired. The more civilized cultures are the ones where you find people trying to destroy each other and call that success. In fact, even in this culture, what you find is if you take young children and teach them cooperative learning and cooperative games, they like it. They learn it. Some experiments have shown that when different experimenters come back weeks or months later with different games or tasks, the kids remember it and they're still cooperating. Now that suggests that we compete because we are raised that way, not because we are born that way. I was in a hotel a couple weeks ago. I was riding the elevator down to the lobby, and there was a pool in the basement, and there were two little boys in bathing suits with towels, and their mother was there. I had a feeling I knew where they were going. And the mother, making conversation, said to the boys, "So who's going to jump in the pool first?" And the boys said in unison, "We both are." And I thought, how long can they hold out? Kids want to have a good time. Kids want to learn. Kids want to do all kinds of great things. Our goal as parents and teachers and people and future parents and teachers is for kids to have a good time, to learn to the best of their ability, to feel good about themselves, to develop loving relationships. What does competition have to do with any of those things? But the most important point I'm making now is, if we are competitive and believe it's a good thing, it's because we were carefully socialized. Kind of a waste of time, by the way, to socialize us all so carefully to compete if it's human nature, isn't it? That would be redundant. It would be superfluous. Why would we bother to teach people to compete? We wouldn't have to. Well, in fact, it's not redundant. We compete because we were taught to do so. All right. The second myth, and the one that you hear equally often, is that competition is necessary to be productive. If you want to reach excellence, you got to try to be a winner. You got to try to be number one. And without it, we'd all become fat and lazy and mediocre. Instantly. No competition, no reason to succeed. Now, I'll make a confession here. When I started researching this subject, I bought this. I assumed it was true. I didn't buy the other myths. I assumed it wasn't human nature. I thought it was destructive in other respects. But I assumed that there would be some trade-off here. In order to get a healthier and happier society and group of individuals, we'd have to give up some productivity. Well, I was wrong. I have been through hundreds, literally hundreds of studies based on classroom and workplace that have showed conclusively that cooperation or working together is far more effective, bottom line effective, at getting people to produce well or learn effectively than competition. I'm not talking about being nice and happy. I'm talking about how well you do. I tell you about there's so many studies, I hardly know where to begin, and I have no time really to sort through them now. You may just take my word for it. Let me just tell you about one that was done with intentional competition. A study from the University of Texas showed that the people who performed best in their respective fields were those who liked what they did, who enjoyed challenging tasks, but who didn't like competition. This was so surprising to the researchers, who assumed, like most of us would have assumed, that competitive people are going to do better, that they ran the experiment again, and instead of using scientists, they used businessmen. And they got the same thing. And then they did it with airline pilots, and then they did it with undergraduates, and then they did it with fourth graders, and then they did it with airline reservations agents, each time using a different measure of success, and each time finding the same thing. The people who did the best were the people who were not concerned about triumphing over others. There are other studies that shows that's true with structural competition. There's a classic study in the 50s showing that people who were job placement agents, employment agents, were able to be far more effective when they worked as a team than when they tried to beat each other for who placed the most people. Here's a good study on creativity, another aspect of it, done by a friend of mine at Brandeis University, back where I come from. She took 7 to 11-year-old girls and said, "I want you to make silly collages." Try to get them as creative as possible. And she said to group 1, "Okay, there's going to be a prize for whoever does the best collage. Okay? So go." And then she went to group 2 and she said, "I just want you to make collages as well as you possibly can," and didn't say anything about competition. Then she collected all the collages and mixed them up and showed them to professional artists who didn't even know what she was studying. And they rated how good the collages were, and what do you think they found? Competition killed creativity. The ones who did a much better job were those who didn't have to compete. Their collages were more spontaneous, more original, more complex, more varied. Every study I have seen with children, with adults, with classroom, with workplace, regardless of how it's measured, shows exactly the same thing. In the classroom, it is particularly clear. And the only difference that is found among these studies is that the more complicated the task is, the more competition is destructive. Why? Why? This makes no sense. Doesn't competition push us to do well? I think there are 3 reasons why. The first is that competition causes anxiety. If you're worried about someone else stepping on your face to get ahead, you're not going to be able to do your best work. The second reason is that cooperation allows us to share our talents, our skills, our resources with each other. You can't do that in competition. Well, you could, but you'd be carted off to the mental institution. Why would you share with somebody whose success is at the price of your failure? So you're never going to do it. People say to me with a sort of triumphant sneer, oh yeah, you don't think competition's any good? Do you think we would have gotten to the moon if we weren't competing against the Russians? I think we would have gotten to the moon a lot sooner. There are 2 space programs going on. Competition is duplicative. It's wasteful. They're working on a problem we've already solved. We're working on a problem they've already solved. But we're competitors, so we can't share our knowledge and do a better job together. This is true in every field. It's certainly true in the classroom, but it's also true in workplaces too. And the third reason competition destroys productivity is the most interesting, I think, the simplest and yet in a way the most complex. And that is this. Doing well and beating others are 2 completely different things. Not only in theory, but in practice they pull in opposite directions. Psychologists use the phrase intrinsic motivation, which is another one of those fancy phrases where none is needed, which means you like what you do. And no artificial incentive, no external carrot dangled in front of you like money or grades is ever going to get the performance from you to equal the performance you will do if you like what you're doing. You know that's true. No amount of dangling rewards can, and the worst reward of all in this respect is competition. Because not only do these external rewards do less well at motivating us than enjoying what you're doing, but they have a very sad effect, a corrosive effect. They undermine your enjoyment. So after a while of working for the goal, of working for the money or the grade or the competition, that's the only reason you're doing it now. Take that away, you lost interest. There once was an old man who was taunted by neighborhood children. They would come out to him, to his yard, every day after school and yell things at him. Hey, you stupid old bald-headed... They did this quite a bit, and it got old real fast. So he decided to come up with a plan to try to stop them. So he came out one day and he said, if you all come back tomorrow and yell these things, I'll pay each of you $1. Well, this was a surprise. They came back even earlier the next day, even more of them, and they yelled even louder about how stupid and ugly and bald he was. And he came out, and just as he promised, he said, thank you, here's your $1, here's your $1, here's your $1, here's your... He said, if you come back tomorrow and yell those things, I can pay you $0.25. They thought, well, that was still pretty good. So they came out and they yelled how stupid and ugly he was. And he came out and he paid them, here's your $0.25, thank you, your $0.25, your $0.25. He says, if you come back tomorrow, I can only pay you $0.01. They said, $0.01? Forget it. And they never came back again. You see what's going on there? He bought off their intrinsic interest by getting them to think of themselves as doing it for the external reward. When the reward disappeared, so did their interest. That was the plan. But that is not the plan of corporate managers and of teachers, and that is exactly what they are doing nonetheless. Well-meaning people trying to get folks to perform are using things like competition and grades, and then you're no longer curious about the subject matter at all. I'll tell you about another study. This time I'll make you the competitive group. This one was done in the University of Rochester. They took a bunch of college students and they gave them an interesting spatial puzzle task to do. And this group, they said, You get a prize, whoever's the best. You're trying to do this as fast as you can, okay? There's only one winner. Go. And to this group, no competition, just work on it. Then individually, each of the students was taken into another room, and the experimenter said, I have to go do something else for about 5 minutes. Just sit here for a bit before we go on to the next part of the experiment. Here's a copy of a puzzle just like the one you worked on a few minutes ago. You can work on it some more. You can read this magazine. You can do whatever you want. I'll be right back. And then they watched them through one-way mirrors, as social psychologists love to do. Makes you wonder sometimes, in fact. And what do you think happened? The students who had been trying to compete at this task were no longer interested in doing it. The students who had worked at precisely the same task for precisely the same amount of time a few minutes ago, who didn't have to compete, continued working on the puzzle. A brief exposure to competition was enough to destroy interest. No wonder performance goes down. No wonder all these studies show that competition is the antithesis of excellence. Not a way to get there. Because when you're thinking of winning and losing, you're not thinking about what you're doing and you don't like it anymore. Remember this kid in class? Ooh, 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 call on me. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Remember this? You don't do this anymore when you get to college. Now you're cool. But it's the same thing. But in elementary school, ooh, ooh, ooh. Teacher finally calls on the kid. What was the question again? Why? Why? Because the kid isn't thinking about the question, about the subject matter. The kid is thinking about being number one. The child is not focused on success. The child is focused on victory. And they pull in opposite directions. And that's why that second belief is also a myth. Competition is not necessary for excellence. Its absence is necessary for excellence. The third myth is that competition is necessary to have a good time. You want to have a good time, you play games. You want to play games, you have to have winners and losers, right? Like all musical chairs here. Take away a kid, take away a chair. Out, 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 out. Till at the end, you've got one 4-year-old sitting there triumphant, everyone else excluded from play. Losers. That's how you learn to have a good time in America. Terry Orlick at the University of Ottawa says, hey, let's be inventive here. What if we kept the same structure of the game, took away a chair, but we made the objective be for the kids to fit on a diminishing number of chairs, until at the end you've got 7 or 8 giggling kids trying to squish onto one chair. Everybody plays till the end, everybody has a good time. It's not so hard to redesign recreation. The playing field doesn't have to be a battlefield. A game is fun because it involves overcoming some obstacle. But the obstacle doesn't have to be somebody else. The obstacle can be something intrinsic to the task itself, like fewer chairs, or a clock that's running out, or trying to reach an exact tie. There are lots of ways to do this. Somebody suggests playing volleyball. Every time you hit the ball over the net, you duck under the net and become part of the other team. The objective is to change the teams as quickly as possible without dropping the ball. Who won? Who knows? The teams are fluid. Who cares? People are too busy having a good time to be thinking about who won. Once again, not the same thing. Terry Orlick took young kids and taught them cooperative games, and he taught them the usual competitive games. 2/3 of the boys and all of the girls prefer the cooperative games. You say to me, I like competitive games. I think they're fun. I like to watch them. I like to play them. Have you tasted any alternative? Not if you grew up in the same country I did. You were raised from the beginning to think that having a good time means you have to try to beat other people. And the last myth I want to deal with is that competition builds character. I'm never sure what people mean exactly when they say this. They never define their terms, but I think it has something to do with self-confidence or self-esteem or something like that. Here's the way I summarize what the research says in the social sciences on this question. Competition is to self-esteem as sugar is to teeth. Competition is to self-esteem as sugar is to teeth. Now, the idea of self-esteem is that even when you screw up, you still feel good about yourself. You don't feel like you're a bad person. Is competition good for promoting that? It's a disaster. When you lose, you feel terrible about yourself. But even when you win, it doesn't last. Everybody knows that. If you've won, for a while you're euphoric, you're impossible to live with. Then you come crashing back down. And you need more competition to get to the same feeling, exactly like building up a tolerance to a drug. What you get from competition is not any kind of emotional needs being met. What you get is a dependence on competition to solve your psychological problems, which it actually creates. It's like drinking salt water when you're thirsty. The solution is really the problem. Look, we feel terrible about ourselves when we lose. We don't feel great when we win. And the whole time we become dependent on this structure. In fact, the studies show that people who are not competitive, who are cooperative, have a stronger sense of themselves. Cooperation doesn't mean you're all lost in some big groovy group and there's no self anymore. You have a stronger sense of working with others and who you are. In competition, you're completely dependent on other people, contrary to the myth of the Lone Ranger kind of, I do it all myself, individualistic competitor. When you compete, you need other people to beat, and you need other people to watch you beat them. You become more external, not internal, not strong, not self-dependent. In addition to these four myths, there is the factor of how competition affects our relationships with other people. Will you trust me when I tell you that lots and lots and lots of studies show that people like each other more when they cooperate with them than when they compete against them? Does that sound kind of... Now, what I want to get you to see is that that's always true. It's not bad competitors here. It's not people who haven't learned how to compete. I mean, think about how you view other people in the context of competition. We hate losers. We're contemptuous of losers. In fact, there's no uglier word in the American dictionary than loser. And we envy winners. And envy is not a particularly pleasant emotion either. And we're suspicious about just about everyone. We hold people at arm's length. I mean, why would I really want to get to know you? Why would I trust you? Why would I be sensitive towards you? Why would I take your point of view if you're a rival, somebody who has been set up against me? Competition has that effect of setting us against one another. And so hostility is a natural and logical reaction to I win only if you lose. Just like cheating, which brings us back full circle. All of those abuses are not contaminants of competition, but they flow very naturally from the arrangement. Which leaves us in the position of saying, what do we do about all of this? And there is no easy answer to this problem. I know what the wrong answer is, though, pretty clearly. The wrong answer is to say, it's a competitive world out there and I better fit in. It's a competitive world out there, world here, of course, meaning American society. Let's not lose sight of that. It's a competitive world out there, and therefore I better do all I can to make sure I'm number one. I better raise my children so they know how to compete, and they like it, and they're part of it. That's the wrong answer. It's the wrong answer first because of all the destructive effects it has while we think we're helping ourselves. And it's the wrong answer second because all that does is perpetuate competition and this poison in another generation. Why does competition continue if it's not part of human nature? This is why. Because we raise children to say they've got to fit into society as it is rather than doing something about it to try to change it. There has got to be an approach that looks not just, sure, change the intentional competition, change the personal, do all of that stuff like the self-help books would tell you if they were ever written to try to challenge competition instead of trying to, like the books called How to Be Number One and Step on Other People's Faces, those best-selling books. If they were trying to get you to overcome competition, they would all be geared at you. If you can't go into psychotherapy, here's what you do. And I think most of the advice that a book like that would give is probably sound. It would say, why did I interrupt him again? Stop. Maybe I have something to learn from him instead of always trying to show how much cleverer I am. Or stop. Why am I looking at that woman over there and saying she's so much thinner than I am? There are always going to be people who are thinner than you are. What's the point? Stop trying to beat do all of that stuff. Try to change your mindset. Stop your automatic assumption that it's important to know whether you're, like the student game, what'd you get? How much better you are than others, and so on. But that's not going to do it. You can't solve these problems just by changing the individuals. You can't solve any of the problems you're going to hear about this week just by changing individuals. There was a slogan in the 60s you may have heard of that says, "The personal is political." And in this respect, this is absolutely true. You're going to hear about homelessness. Many of those people who are homeless are also illiterate. And they've been raised to think. They didn't have to be raised to think. They've naturally come to the assumption that this is my problem. It's my fault. It speaks poorly of me. Everybody else can read. I can't, and I've just got to sneak through life. Why aren't funds allocated to solve problems like that? Because these people aren't a powerful political constituency precisely because of their problem. Separate them, one from another, except for the few people you may run into on a bench. You will hear about incest and rape. I did some research on the subject of child sexual abuse, and I couldn't believe it myself. I went back and calculated it again. On the basis of most of the polls that have been done, something like 40 million adults have been abused sexually as children. And most of them grow up thinking of themselves as damaged goods. If they're able to confront the problem at all, it's only insofar to think as there's something screwed up about me that I brought this on myself. And they feel guilty and depressed and have low self-esteem. But this is a massive problem, and the more attention we give to how significant it is and what attitudes about men and women, or parents and adults we have, the more we start to bring those to the surface, the more we realize that this is not just something you have to deal with by yourself. This is true of all oppression. The best way to keep people oppressed in any environment is to make them think that it's all their fault. To construe the problem as individual from the very beginning. And it's true with competition as well. We've got to understand that it requires making big changes. Some of them can be implemented sooner than others. We can implement I will show you immediately how to change classrooms for those instructors who are here into places where students learn from each other. Because the most important relationship in a classroom is not between student and teacher, and it's not between student and the test, the material to be learned, it's between student and student. All of us are smarter than any of us. And that's where we learn best. And you don't simply say to the kids, get together, students, any college students or second graders, all right, get together in a group and help each other. You've got to structure it carefully so there's an incentive. Not altruism, I don't care about me, I'm just going to help you. I succeed only if you succeed too. That's what cooperation means. We sink or swim together. No one is finished in this group until everyone understands. That's the teacher who's got to do that. It's the workplace manager who's got to do that, and I talk to those people about how to implement that. It's cooperative recreation for ourselves and our children. The bigger change is, how do you devise a political and an economic system for 250 million people that's totally non-competitive and democratic and productive? Whoops, we're out of time. I was going to give you my instant blueprint for doing that, but you can't argue with the clock. Those are big problems where we've got to put our collective ingenuity to work on them and begin by realizing that these problems can only be solved by changing the structure, not just the individual. And that's the lesson I would leave you with respect to the idea of oppression in general and competition in particular. The real alternative to being number one is not being number two. It's being able to dispense with those rankings altogether. Thanks very much. If you can stay, we'll take questions.
If you'd like to ask questions, feel free to come down front.
Or even not. Why don't we give 15 seconds or 30 seconds so people can clear out and talk about how he still sounds like a communist, and then the rest of us can ask questions and talk. No, not this down front. Just one second. Do we want to do this here or informally stand?